On a crisp afternoon in a luxurious parkside cafe, the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers and freshly baked bread. Waiters, dressed impeccably in tailored uniforms, glided seamlessly between tables, their trays laden with plates of vibrant, gourmet meals. The hum of quiet conversation interspersed with the occasional clink of glasses created an atmosphere of sophistication and charm. Outside, the sun painted golden streaks across the manicured gardens, casting long shadows over the cobblestone path that led to this haven for the city's elite. At the heart of the cafe, seated at the most coveted table, was Edward Kensington, a name that carried weight in every boardroom and luxury gathering in the city. A self-made billionaire, Edward's sharp suit and diamond-studded cufflinks reflected his unparalleled success and unyielding ambition. Yet as he adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, there was a fatigue in his posture, a subtle weariness that hinted at the burdens of his towering empire. Across from him sat Eleanor, his wife, a vision of beauty and sophistication. Her raven-black hair framed a face that belonged on magazine covers, her scarlet lips and shimmering diamond bracelet completing the picture of a woman who seemed to have it all. Eleanor's laughter chimed softly, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She twirled the bracelet on her wrist absent-mindedly, her gaze occasionally drifting away from Edward. There was a tension between them, unspoken yet palpable, as if the opulence surrounding them was masking an unseen fissure. A few steps away, in the shadow of the patio railing, stood Tommy. The boy's oversized, tattered hoodie barely protected him from the crisp air. His dark, hollow eyes scanned the tables with precision, searching not for wealth or luxury, but for the chance to survive another day. Hunger was a constant companion, gnawing at his stomach and pushing him toward desperation. Yet Tommy wasn't a thief. He had rules, even here at the edge of society's glimmering facade. His gaze locked on Edward's table, where the tantalizing aroma of soup wafted in the air, calling to him like a siren's song. But then Tommy saw something that made his hunger momentarily fade. Eleanor, her movements graceful yet deliberate, slipped a small vial from her designer handbag. With a practiced flick of her fingers, she twisted it open and poured its contents into the steaming bowl. The liquid blended seamlessly, leaving no trace of its presence. Tommy's breath hitched as he watched, frozen in disbelief. He strained to hear over the din, catching fragments of her words as she leaned toward Edward. "After all I've endured," she murmured, her voice laced with venom, "you won't ruin this for me." Tommy's mind raced, his instincts battling his fear. Could he really have just witnessed what he thought? The poised and polished woman before him. Was she capable of something so sinister? He wanted to turn away, to convince himself it wasn't his problem. But the sight of Edward's hand reaching for the spoon rooted him to the spot. The man had no idea of the danger looming inches from his lips. "Don't eat that," Tommy shouted, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter like a knife. Head snapped toward him, the hum of the cafe falling in a stunned silence. Edward froze mid-motion, his wide eyes locking onto Tommy. Eleanor's head whipped around, her polished demeanor faltering as a flicker of shock flashed across her face. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the cafe suspended in the gravity of the boy's words. The cafe fell silent, the once lively chatter and clinking of silverware replaced by an oppressive stillness. Edward froze, his spoon suspended inches from his lips, the steam from the bowl curling in delicate spirals. Across from him, Eleanor's sharp gaze snapped to Tommy, her polished composure teetering on the edge of collapse. "What did you just say?" Eleanor demanded, her voice a knife's edge. The forced elegance in her tone could not mask the tremor of panic beneath it. Tommy took a shaky step forward, his tattered hoodie swaying slightly as he moved. "I saw her," he said, his voice wavering but firm. "She put something in your soup." Each word hung heavy in the air, an anchor pulling the room's attention squarely onto him. Eleanor's laughter came quick and sharp, like shards of broken glass scattered across the floor. "This is absurd," she scoffed, tossing her hair over her shoulder with feigned indignation. "Look at him. Just a street rat causing trouble for attention. Surely you're not going to entertain this nonsense. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, their curiosity piqued. Eyes darted between Eleanor, Edward, and the boy who had interrupted their genteel afternoon. Edward's hand trembled as he set the spoon down, his gaze narrowing as he turned toward his wife. "Eleanor," he said slowly, his voice low and measured, but tense with suspicion. "What's going on here?" Eleanor's face twisted into a mask of indignation, her carefully curated poise beginning to fracture. "Edward," she said, her voice rising, "you're not seriously going to believe this child over me, are you? He's obviously trying to extort you for money." Tommy's fists clenched tightly at his sides. "I'm not lying," he exclaimed, his voice rising with desperation. "Smell it. Test it. Do something, but don't eat it." His eyes burned with urgency as he took another step forward, his gaze locked on Edward. A waiter, who had been frozen in place, took a tentative step toward the table. "Sir," he said cautiously, his voice barely above a whisper, "should I call the police?" Edward's jaw tightened as he considered his options, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a vice. Finally, he nodded, his sharp eyes never leaving Eleanor. "Do it," he said, his voice steely with resolve. The murmur of the crowd grew louder as the waiter hurried inside to make the call. Eleanor's composure crumbled further, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Edward, you can't be serious," she cried, her voice cracking. "You're going to let some filthy street kid ruin our lunch?" Edward ignored her outburst, his gaze fixed on Tommy. "You said you saw her put something in the soup," he said, his tone calm but probing. "What exactly did you see?" Tommy's breath hitched as all eyes fell on him. Swallowing hard, he took another step closer to the table. "It was a small bottle," he said, his voice steadier now. "She poured a clear liquid into the bowl when you weren't looking, and then she stirred it. I swear, I saw everything." Edward's expression darkened as he turned back to Eleanor, whose face had gone pale. "Eleanor," he said, his voice cutting through the mounting tension like a blade. "What is he talking about?" Eleanor's mouth opened and closed, her words failing her. Her usual quick wit had deserted her, leaving her grasping for a defense. "He's lying," she said finally, her voice trembling. "He's trying to ruin us." The sound of approaching sirens cut through the murmurs of the crowd, their wail growing louder with each passing second. The cafe patrons exchanged wide-eyed glances, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Tommy stood his ground, his fists still clenched but his resolve unshaken. He had done his part. Now, it was up to Edward to decide what came next. When the police officers entered the cafe moments later, the tension in the room reached its breaking point. All eyes turned to the table at the center of the drama. Edward's face was a mask of fury and disbelief as he pointed toward the bowl of soup. "Test it," he ordered, his voice unwavering. "And take her statement." Eleanor's carefully constructed world began to crumble as the officers stepped forward, their presence marking the beginning of an unraveling that no amount of wealth or influence could halt. Tommy exhaled deeply, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to subside. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that he had made a difference. As the wail of sirens drew closer, the cracks in Eleanor's composure became fissures. Her hands trembled as she clutched her designer handbag, her polished veneers slipping away with every passing second. "This is absurd," she hissed through clenched teeth, her voice dripping with desperation. "I won't sit here and be humiliated like this." Edward's hand shot out, his grip firm on her wrist. The usually unflappable billionaire now looked like a man who had been struck by a storm but refused to bow to it. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice low but commanding. His piercing gaze bore into hers, a silent demand for the truth. "Not until we get answers." The piercing blue and red lights of the police cars bathed the cafe in a surreal glow as two officers entered, their presence shifting the atmosphere from tense to electric. Edward quickly recounted Tommy's claims, his words measured, but carrying an undeniable weight. One officer stepped forward, his gloved hand carefully lifting the bowl of soup. He leaned in, sniffing the contents before straightening, his expression grim. "There's a faint chemical odor," the officer said, his tone neutral but authoritative. The murmur of the crowd grew louder, a wave of whispers rippling through the patrons. Eleanor's face went ashen. "This is ridiculous," she shrieked, her voice climbing an octave. "He's framing me. This street rat is trying to ruin us for his own gain." Her words were sharp, but the hysteria in her tone betrayed her fear. Tommy stepped forward, his hands trembling, but his resolve unbroken. "I'm not lying," he said, his voice firm despite the quiver. "I saw her." She took out a small vial and poured something into the soup. Then she stirred it like nothing happened. The officer's gaze shifted back to Eleanor. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but unyielding, "do you have an explanation for this?" For a moment, Eleanor faltered, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. The weight of the mounting evidence pressed down on her, and the veneer she had so carefully crafted shattered. "Fine," she spat, her voice venomous, her facade crumbling entirely. "Yes, I did it. I was tired of being his accessory, his trophy. I wanted my freedom, and this was the only way to get it." The cafe erupted in gasps. Patrons leaned closer, their disbelief painted across their faces. The once elegant woman now stood exposed, her ambition and bitterness laid bare. The officers moved swiftly, one pulling out a pair of handcuffs while the other stepped closer. Eleanor didn't resist as her hands were secured behind her back, but her eyes burned with defiance. "You don't understand," she screamed as they began to lead her away. "I deserve more. I deserved everything he had." Her cries echoed through the stunned cafe, fading into the distance as she was escorted outside. Edward remained seated, his face a mask of disbelief and sorrow. The weight of betrayal pressed heavily on his shoulders, his once unshakable world now crumbling around him. Tommy stood rooted in place, his chest heaving as the adrenaline coursing through him began to ebb. For a moment, he felt a pang of uncertainty, unsure if he had done the right thing. But as Edward turned to him, his expression softened, gratitude replacing the anguish in his eyes. "You saved my life," Edward said quietly, his voice filled with both pain and sincerity. "And for that, I'll always be grateful." The cafe's patrons remained silent, the gravity of what had transpired hanging thick in the air. It was a moment no one would soon forget, a reminder of the courage it takes to speak the truth and the price of betrayal. Edward sat in stunned silence, his gaze fixed on the untouched bowl of soup before him. The once vibrant chatter of the cafe had dimmed to hushed whispers, the weight of the recent events hanging heavily in the air. Around him, patrons exchanged wide-eyed glances, their meals forgotten as they pieced together the extraordinary scene they had just witnessed. Slowly, Edward's eyes shifted to Tommy, who stood a few steps away, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his tattered hoodie. The boy's shoulders were hunched, and his face was a mixture of exhaustion and uncertainty, as though he was contemplating whether to slip away unnoticed. "Tommy," Edward said softly, his voice breaking the silence. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Please sit." Tommy hesitated, his dark eyes darting around the room as if expecting someone to stop him. When no one did, he cautiously stepped forward and slid into the chair. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he feared breaking something fragile. Edward leaned forward, his piercing gaze studying the boy. "You saved my life," he said, his voice filled with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "Why?" Tommy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers fidgeting with the frayed hem of his hoodie. He paused, his voice faltering. "I couldn't let it happen." Edward's eyes softened as he took in the boy's thin frame and wary expression. The sincerity in Tommy's words was undeniable. "But why would you risk this?" Edward asked, his tone gentle but probing. "For someone like me?" Tommy shrugged, his gaze dropping to the table. "Because it was the right thing to do," he murmured, the simplicity of his answer striking Edward like a hammer. For a moment, neither spoke. The cafe seemed to hold its breath, the tension slowly giving way to a fragile sense of normalcy. Edward's mind raced, replaying the day's events and the courage of the boy sitting before him. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black phone. "I want to help you," Edward said firmly, his voice steady. "You deserve better than this." Tommy's eyes widened, and he shook his head quickly. "I didn't do this for money or anything," he said, his voice defensive. He trailed off, unsure how to finish. Edward smiled faintly, his expression tinged with admiration. "I know," he said. "That's why I want to help. What you did today took courage most people don't have. The world needs more people like you." Tommy hesitated, his gaze flicking to the door as though weighing his options. But something in Edward's tone made him pause. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of something he thought he'd lost: hope. Edward's gaze softened as he looked across the table at Tommy, a boy who had risked everything to do the right thing. The cafe had mostly returned to normal, but the scene that had unfolded moments ago still lingered in the air, an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed it. "Tell me about yourself, Tommy," Edward said gently, leaning forward. "I want to understand how someone as young as you could have the courage to do what you did today." Tommy hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the frayed edge of his hoodie. His eyes darted around the room before settling back on Edward. "I've been living on the streets for 2 years," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "After my parents," he paused, swallowing hard. "After they died, there was no one left for me. I've been on my own ever since." Edward's chest tightened. The boy's thin frame and wary demeanor suddenly made sense. "And no one helped you?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief and guilt. Tommy shook his head. "People don't notice kids like me," he said bitterly. "I've had to fight just to survive. Most days, I'm just trying to find enough to eat and somewhere safe to sleep." His voice cracked, and he looked away, embarrassed by his vulnerability. Edward's heart ached. He had spent his life building an empire, focused on wealth and power, while kids like Tommy fell through the cracks. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You should have never had to go through that." Tommy shrugged, his expression guarded. "It's just how it is." But Edward wasn't willing to accept that. He reached for his phone, dialing a number with practiced precision. After a brief conversation, he hung up and turned back to Tommy. "I've arranged for you to stay in a safe shelter tonight," he said. "You won't have to sleep on the streets anymore." Tommy's eyes widened. "Why would you do that for me?" he asked, his voice filled with both wonder and suspicion. Edward's expression grew serious. "Because you deserve more than survival," he said firmly. "What you did today showed incredible strength and character. Let me help you build a future." Tommy blinked rapidly, tried to hold back tears. "But I don't even know what that looks like," he admitted. "I've never had anyone care like that before." Edward leaned back, his mind already racing with possibilities. "You'll have time to figure it out," he assured the boy. "My foundation can provide education, mentorship, and support. We'll make sure you have everything you need to succeed." Tommy's defenses began to crumble. "Why would you do all this for me?" he asked, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. Edward's gaze didn't waver. "Because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten," he said softly. "That real strength isn't in wealth or power. It's in doing what's right, even when it's hard. You showed me that today." For the first time in years, Tommy allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. "What if I mess it up?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Edward smiled gently. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Tommy, and you've more than earned yours." The boy's lips trembled as he nodded, his tears finally spilling over. Edward reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Tommy's shoulder. "This is the beginning of something new," Edward said. "You're not alone anymore." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the cafe, Tommy realized that his life was about to change. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he had thought lost forever: hope for a brighter tomorrow. News of the dramatic incident at the cafe spread quickly, capturing the attention of the city and beyond. Headlines hailed Tommy as a hero. "Street boy saves billionaire from poison plot," and his story touched the hearts of millions. Donations began pouring into the shelter Edward supported, transforming it into a haven for countless homeless children. For the first time, the shelter had the resources to provide not just food and beds, but education, counseling, and hope. Tommy, once invisible to the world, suddenly found himself at the center of a community that celebrated his courage. Strangers reached out with words of encouragement, local businesses offered support, and the shelter became a bustling hub of opportunity. Edward's foundation expanded its efforts, inspired by Tommy's story, to create programs that empowered underprivileged youth to dream beyond their circumstances. Years passed, and Tommy's life transformed in ways he could never have imagined. With Edward's mentorship and the support of the foundation, Tommy excelled in school, earning a scholarship to a prestigious university. He poured his energy into studying law, driven by a desire to advocate for those who had no voice, children like he had once been. One evening, Tommy stood beside Edward at a glittering charity gala. The event was held to celebrate the foundation's achievements and to honor the young man who had inspired it all. Tommy, now a confident young adult, wore a tailored suit that fit him as comfortably as his newfound purpose in life. The room buzzed with applause as Edward introduced him to the stage. Taking a deep breath, Tommy stepped forward, the spotlight casting a warm glow on his determined face. He looked out at the crowd, filled with influential figures who had the power to create change. "A few years ago," he began, his voice steady, "I was just a scared, hungry kid, invisible to the world. But I saw something wrong, and I knew I couldn't stay silent." He paused, his gaze sweeping the audience. "If someone like me with nothing to lose but everything to fear could stand up for what's right, then anyone can. Kindness and courage don't require wealth or power, just a willingness to act." The room erupted into applause, a standing ovation that echoed with the impact of his words. As Tommy stepped down, he caught Edward's proud smile and knew that this was just the beginning of the ripples they had created together.